let's dive into some reasonable expectations tonight. I've had a lot of fun doing this because it is not an official prediction, mind you. We'll do that in August, but it's kind of one of those things where as we're starting to enter preview magazine season and we're starting to have a lot of these fan bases set their own expectation level, we're just kind of here to guide you along. We're kind of here to do what the NCAA hasn't done with NIL. We're going to give you the guardrails. Just keep it between the lines. Let's not go out of whack. Let's not predict 12-0 when the over-under 7 on the win total. What are reasonable expectations for some of these programs? Let's start with the Florida Gators. Why? Because one of you suggested it in the comments section, and I read every one of them. So Florida this year, the over-under win total, depending on where you look, is 7. Last year they were a 6-17. What is reasonable for Florida Gator fans to expect from this team this year? I said 8-4. And I'm going to give you several reasons why here. As their over-under is 7, I'm going to go one above that. I think it's reasonable for you guys down in Ocala, down in Gainesville and the like to expect 8-4. Their biggest concern's not on the surface. Their biggest concern is kind of hidden beneath the surface. It's called a depth chart. And once you look past the ones, as Billy Napier, head coach there now, was talking about all throughout spring, you start to see some areas where, we're really thin here. We're really thin there. They had to alter the way they practiced in spring because they didn't have adequate depth. Certain places. It's not the first time that's ever happened. Normally, when you have a new coaching staff in town, it's because something along those lines needs to be fixed. But even having said that, if you look at Florida, this is not a poor man's program. This is not a start over from scratch type situation. I mean, they got a quarterback in Anthony Richardson who, if you believe the comment section, half of our viewers think will contend for a spot in New York City in the Heisman Trophy finalist ceremony. I'm not quite that far down the road on Anthony Richardson hype, but I do understand the hype. It's not like I don't believe in him. But outside of him, you look at their situations on the lines of scrimmage, you look at what held them back last year, and it's fixable. It's fixable really quick. What held Florida back last year is not what holds a lot of programs down. What holds a lot of these teams down is they're just not good enough. They're not talented enough. They don't recruit at a high enough level. That's not the problem. Even under Dan Mullen, wasn't the problem in Gainesville. They were terrible in the turnover battle. They only won it in one game last year. They were plus turnovers in one game last year, and I think it was an FCS opponent. And also, they got penalized every other play. They got penalized 104 times. By comparison, their competition got penalized 67 times. It may take a year or 2 or 3 years to overturn certain things. That stuff right there can get corrected overnight if you got the right staff in town. I happen to believe they do have the right staff in town. Billy Napier and his crew were 40-12 at Louisiana, somewhere around there. It's in the low 40s and it's in the low teens. And my point is, if you wait and you take the opportunity to give Billy Napier comparable resources to his competition, just like he had in the Sun Belt, I think he absolutely has it within himself to deliver on those results. My point is, it's not going to take 3 years to get there. They're a lot closer maybe than it seems. Their 2022 schedule, if you're listening on podcast, starts with a bang. They got Utah coming in. Now here's the fortuitous part, and here's kind of what I'll wait for all year with Florida. If you've got depth concerns, they don't always pop up in week 1. Because sometimes it actually takes injury to expose some of those depth concerns, whether it's wide out or defensive line. But as you get deeper in the season, then all of a sudden attrition starts to become a reality. I wonder how deep Florida can get in the season before you do start to suffer some of those things. That's not predictable. No one can know. But they got Utah and Kentucky along with Tennessee in the first month of the season. And those are 3 of their bigger games. So for me to get to 8-4 as a reasonable expectation, I'm sitting there thinking, well, if Florida can go 2-1 minimum in the first month of the season, then yeah, they got a game against Georgia later in the year. Yeah, they got to go to A&M. We'll let that be what it is. This is year 1. We're not calling 11-1, but 8-4 I think is reasonable for Florida. Again, it's going to be very, very, even disproportionately reliant on staying healthy as long as they can. You can say that about every team. I know in these prediction type segments, we always talk about depth and we talk about injury. Yeah, it's a problem everyone wants to avoid. Some teams are more predisposed to being victimized by it than others. So Florida's over-under win total is 7 in Vegas. I think it's reasonable to say 8-4. Next up, the Texas Longhorns. Let's head out to Austin. Their over-under win total at most books right now is 9. Do you think that's lofty, by the way? A lot of you have gone back and forth with what you think about my reasonable expectation. I'll give you my reasonable expectation for Texas in a second. I want to know the Vegas number. How many of you look at that and say, ooh, that's easy money, one way or the other? Because right now, they're heavily juiced, they are juiced a little bit more heavy towards the under right now. But it's at 9. The over-under's 9. They didn't make a bowl game last year. So there is a quantum leap in win-loss production expected here, just according to that over-under. I think it's a reasonable number, though. So my reasonable expectation, my record that I think it's okay for you to expect if you're a Texas Longhorn fan is 9-3. It's not going to be easy to get there. But let's chart the path, shall we? What was a problem last year? What kept them down? Why didn't Texas make a bowl game last year? Well, first and foremost, they had too much indecision at the quarterback position. That started in fall camp. It never really subsided. I don't think that's where it ended, though. That's just where it began. They could not get to the quarterback. Their leader, I think, in total sacks was Ben Davis, the Alabama transfer, who had 2.5. So they were woefully inept at affecting the quarterback. They could not force turnovers. I think they were in the 100s nationally in that department. So they couldn't force turnovers. They couldn't affect the quarterback. They had inconsistency offensively. They were a very bad second half team. They finished on a terrible losing streak. So if I'm to believe that there's this quantum leap in improvement that's going to happen, and we're going to go from a 5-win team to a 9-win team, a lot of that has to be rectified. Now, as we look on screen, if you're watching on YouTube, at the additions that they've had via the transfer portal, one of them, the second name there, Isaiah Nayer, we're going to talk about a little bit later on in the show. I just go back and ask myself, okay, what tangible evidence do I have that some of those problems from last year are going to be rectified? And I think that there are incremental reasons why I could believe that some of those things are going to be rectified, but there is no bright blinking red light that says, all right, all of it's fixed. Just because they haven't played a football game in 5 or 6 months, all of it's magically going to be fixed. There's nothing magical about the offseason unless you make it count. Otherwise, you just hit the pause on a bad team. So they've made some changes. Obviously, you bring a recruiting class in, that's one thing that changes. You bring a portal class in, that's another thing that changes. You get another year into your tenure. And if you're a new staff, yes, that matters too. But if you were to tell me it's still questionable as to whether they'll be consistent this year, I would buy that. You know why? Because offensive line is one of, if not the biggest questions on this team. And likewise, I don't know that their pass rush is going to magically be fixed overnight. And if you have those problems, if you struggle on the offensive line, therefore, if your quarterback, who himself is going to be a newcomer this year, and Quinn Ewers, is constantly under duress, and you can't affect the other team's quarterback, that leads to, as you well know, wild fluctuation game to game. Therefore, lack of consistency game to game, which puts a lot of games that you don't think you should be threatened in the crosshairs. Like that game at Texas Tech in week 4. None of you guys think you should lose that. But if you got those problems I just talked about, yeah, it's all up in the air. So I look at their schedule here. There are 3 tiers of games. And if I'm going to get to 9-3, here's really what I need. I need to go 4-0 against Louisiana Monroe, UTSA, Kansas, and Texas Tech. No question, need to sweep those. I probably need to go 4-1 against West Virginia, TCU, Iowa State, Baylor, and Kansas State. And I know that grouping there, if you're a Georgia fan, doesn't sound all that daunting. We're talking about Texas right now. And we're talking about going 4-1, again, against West Virginia, TCU, Iowa State, Baylor, Kansas State. It's just not a clip they've been winning at. Oh, and by the way, there's this other tier with teams like Bama. Yeah, they play them this year. Oklahoma, Oklahoma State. They need to go 1-2 minimum against those teams. That's to get to 9-3. We're not talking playoff here with Texas. That's to get to 9-3. But what have you invested out there? What have they asked for as a fan base that you haven't given? I would argue you've given everything you should. And that's the rule on this show. If you give what they ask of you, it's reasonable to have some lofty expectations. So 9-3, I'm not mad at it if that's what you're expecting from Texas. Let's go to Nebraska. I almost said let's stay in the Big 12. Not anymore. We've talked about Nebraska a fair amount over the past month. They were 3-9 last year, famously. And yet the over-under win total for the old Huskers this year is 7-5. Well, it's 7.5. Therefore, I thought it necessary to make a reasonable expectation 7-5. That's a big turnaround. I had Stats and Info run the numbers, and if you went 3-9 last year and you win 7 games this year, that's over a 100% increase in win total. How are they going to get there? Well, number one, pretty workable schedule, but it was workable last year, and they won 3 games. So something has to change here. Over-under win total sitting at 7.5. Scott Frost, 15-29 as head coach in Nebraska so far. That's bad, yeah, nothing to write home about. Here's really where you just stick the dagger in the ribs and start to twist it. 20 of the 29 losses in Scott Frost's tenure at Nebraska have come by one possession score. 20 of 29 losses by 8 points or less. I don't know where that line in the sand is, where you go from thinking it's just a statistical anomaly to this dude doesn't know how to win close games. But I would not argue with you if you said the line's in the rearview mirror. Wherever it is, we passed it. Maybe it's 10 games or 15 games, but dude, 20 of 29 of those losses by 8 points or fewer. Well, history has shown us that given time, coaches have turned the corner before. So 4 wins, 5 wins, 3 wins, COVID year, 3 wins. All of a sudden, if it goes 7-5 this year, it wouldn't be the first time. It wouldn't be the most shocking thing in the world. How are they going to have it happen, though? Well, at least they didn't stand pat. That's one thing we can say about Nebraska. They realized what we got is not good enough, therefore we got to get something different. And next to USC, they've been the most active team in the transfer portal. Now all that means is they got a bunch of new pieces. How do they fit? Or do they fit together, period? Well, that's what God made the regular season for. To get to 7-5, they need to be 3-0 when they face Oklahoma. And to tell you how easy that should be, and boy, that should is in all caps, for Nebraska, they've got to beat Northwestern, and that's over in Ireland. They're going to be favored by double digits in that game. They will be favored by double digits against North Dakota. They will be favored by double digits against Georgia Southern. And that's it, guys. Those are the 3 games that you need to win in order to make the Week 4 date against Oklahoma a showdown in Lincoln. I keep getting confused because I think they play a Week 0 game. So it's technically Week 3, but we need them to be 3-0 there. From that point, then all of a sudden it just becomes, well, how high can you climb? Because even if Oklahoma comes in there and you give a good spirited effort and you lose, again, as you're watching on YouTube and can clearly see, you got Indiana, Rutgers, Purdue, Illinois. You get to November, and I want to pause at November. These are all winnable. They're all losable. They're also winnable. I want to know how much wiggle room they're going to give themselves by the time they get to November. Because, see, Nebraska fancies themselves, as should everyone up there, a Big Ten West contender. And I agree with that. November is not easy. They play Minnesota at home, then they go to Michigan. They got Wisconsin at home, then they go to Iowa. Probably, I would imagine, the toughest close to the season that any team in the Big Ten West has. That's just off the top of my head. 7-5. 7-5. I think they can do it. There's a wide discrepancy in opinion on Nebraska this year. I think 7-5 is doable. I think it's reasonable. Let me say it that way. I think it's reasonable to expect 7-5 there. Let's go to LSU next. We have not been to Baton Rouge in a couple of shows. So LSU, new head coach, Brian Kelly. What is reasonable to expect in terms of wins and losses? Well, their over-under is 7 wins right now, and I'm going to be at that number. I think it's reasonable to expect 7-5. Now, this is an SEC West program. They've won a national championship in the past 2 years, or 3 years, I guess, now, since we're entering 2022. So no one's going to be happy down there with 7 wins. That's not what this segment's called. It's called What's Reasonable. It is reasonable, coming off of what they just came off of, to expect 7 wins. They were 6-7 last year, so this would be record improvement. Not record-setting improvement, but record by definition improvement. I think they're going to find good enough quarterback play. That's where all the conversation is going to start. SEC Media Days is, actually it's in like 1 month from now. All the talk around Atlanta is going to be about, Brian, who's your quarterback going to be? And that's a great question. I'm just telling you, I'm fairly confident out of Brennan and Jaden Daniels and Garrett Nussmeier, they will have a quarterback good enough to win. They may have more than one, but I think they will settle on one good enough to win for them. That's not what gives me the most optimism for potential early season success here. It's just part of it. Whispers about what to expect from John Emery at the running back position this year, that gives me a little confidence. Their offensive line should be in as good a shape as it's been in quite a while. That gives me confidence. In fact, both lines of scrimmage, they'll have one of the better defensive lines in the country this year. So unlike Texas, where we talked about a lot of variables there, LSU, along the lines of scrimmage, those aren't really areas that we're questioning. And if we fill in the blank of quarterback with B to B plus level play, which I think is reasonable, well, then all of a sudden we look at their schedule. They play Florida State to open the season in New Orleans. I'd argue that's a game that LSU should win. Tight point spread. But if I have those blanks filled in, that's a game they should win. Certainly they should then be 2-0 when Mississippi State comes to town. It's a game they should win. New Mexico, game they should win. There's a lot of should here because that's what segments about college football sound like in June. But if they are 4-0 when they get to that stretch, which gets really, really rough starting in October, then I've done all I can ask Brian Kelly to do, or I've gotten all I can ask from him out of the early stretch. That means that they have springboarded as hard as they possibly can. Springboard, the optimal term here, because they've got to, because eventually gravity is going to set in. And gravity is basically from October 1st on, their schedule. Here it is. It's tough. At Auburn, Tennessee. At Florida, Ole Miss. Alabama. At Arkansas. UAB is supposed to be the layup. Tell Bill Clark that. And then at Texas A&M, just for good measure, to end the season. There is no easy path the rest of the way. Even the UAB game, especially when you consider where it's thrown in there, there is no easy path. I'm also factoring in the possibility that there are some growing pains. In fact, I would call that an inevitability, not a possibility. When you overturn the kind of culture they're overturning down there, when you go from Ed Orgeron's way of doing things to Brian Kelly's way of doing things, it's not possible to do that without having some internal growing pains. It's going to be good for you in the long run. It may mean 7-5 in the short run. So I'm looking right now and I see that possible springboard in the early portion of the season. I see a possible brick wall in the second portion of the season. I think 7-5 is reasonable, and all the while, as you usually have with first-year staffs, you've got one eye on the season, and then you got another eye on the recruiting class. And that'll be LSU in 2022. Lastly here, let's go with Notre Dame. You know, Notre Dame had one regular season loss last year. That was to Cincinnati, by the way. And they were 11-2 overall. They lost the bowl game, gave up a second-half storm from behind against Oklahoma State. And now it's Marcus Freeman's show in South Bend. What's reasonable to expect here? The over-under in Vegas is 9, and that's where I am. I think it's reasonable to expect 9-3. Line of scrimmage is an edge they're going to have in most games. What they inherit up there is built very well from the inside. You know, they're trying to build from the inside out, and fortunately, that inside portion of the team, offensive line, defensive line, it's already pretty well stocked. Tight end as well, pretty well stocked. Probably get the best one in the country, if not one of the very best in the country, and Michael Mayer. But then when you start to get further away from the ball at the wide receiver position, the difference makers probably are not there. And for that matter, I know that there's optimism about Tyler Buckner at quarterback. It's not a proven commodity by any stretch of the imagination, which is a phrase I'm trying to eradicate from the show this year because I said it like 400 million times last year. But anyway, here's another phrase I'm trying to get rid of. I say all that to say this. They're going to be in a lot of close games this year. And that's not even including games like at Ohio State week 1 or maybe even Clemson later in the year. If you're having trouble, getting above that 24-point threshold, if you're having to play every game like a rock fight, it probably spells success against these teams you can out-physical. And there are a lot of them on their schedule. But the reason I'm going 9-3 and then no better is because young quarterback, tight end-centric passing game, and then knowing I've got Ohio State and Clemson on the schedule, I've got to account for a couple of losses there, or at least be reasonable and account for a couple of losses. And then after that, I got to go to Vegas to face Brigham Young. That's a really good passing attack and a mobile quarterback and a unique quarterback in Jaron Hall. I've got to face North Carolina on the road. I've got a late season visit from Boston College before I go to USC. I have no clue what Lincoln Riley's team's going to be by then. That may be a game I need 30 or 35 in. Can I get there? 9-3, all things considered. Also first-year head coach there in Marcus Freeman. All things considered, I think 9-3 is reasonable. So to recap, we're keeping our own internal records because this is a segment, obviously, that's either going to make us look really good or really bad come December. Florida, 8-4, reasonable. Texas, 9-3. Nebraska, 7-5. LSU, 7-5. And Notre Dame, 9-3. Those are not official predictions. That'll be in August, but those, we believe, are reasonable predictions.